Welcome to the second web-based professional development session on curriculum. Our commitment is to provide a variety of professional development opportunities that are designed to offer the tools, resources, and links to teach with the student in mind. You'll be asked to reflect on many questions as you go through the session. When you see the learning log image in the lower left corner, please click the pause button to include your responses to your learning log. You're being asked to turn your completed learning log and an instructional learning plan into your campus instructional effectiveness specialist. Print, open, or save the Curriculum Tier 2 documents listed above this presentation in the Documents folder before you proceed. At the end of the session, click on the quiz link below the video to take a short quiz to check for understanding. Please take the quiz so your completion of this session will be recorded. In the Curriculum Tier 1 Professional Development session, you participated in a mock UBD driver's training course. You were asked to develop the goal, big ideas, essential questions, and the no's and do's for the driver's training course. If needed, please refer back to the Curriculum 1 session and any notes you may have kept from the session. This session will focus on analyzing instructional activities using Bloom's taxonomy, applying the rigor and relevance framework, and finish with the exploration of the components of a learning plan. Let's begin by brainstorming a list of instructional activities you currently use in your classroom. Create a list of at least 3 different instructional strategies. You will be working with the same list of activities throughout this professional development session. Pause and enter your activities in your learning log. Now we will look at Bloom's taxonomy and the intellectual levels of learning. In the 1950s, Benjamin Bloom and a team of psychologists developed a classification of levels of intellectual behavior important in learning. The use of Bloom's classifications is the standard across the board within education. Over the years, the levels of intellectual behavior have undergone revisions. Take a moment to read over the most recent version of the Bloom's taxonomy pyramid that was created in 2000. Next, let's take a closer look at each classification level. Read over the descriptive question for each level of Bloom's to gain a better understanding of that classification level. Now, locate the Bloom's taxonomy chart document found in the Documents folder above this presentation. You may recognize this document from the Curriculum Tier 1 training. Take a moment to look over the chart and the verbs associated with each classification level. There are many verbs listed in the chart that describe the activity types which would fall within each level of Bloom's. Notice how a few verbs fall in multiple levels of the taxonomy. Keep the Bloom's taxonomy chart accessible as this chart will be used throughout this session. Based on brain research, the more we can get our students to the application level or above, the better for student learning and the transfer of learning. First and second grade students can apply what they have learned in the classroom. Your students can be held to this level of learning. We don't have to wait until our students are sophomores in college to expect them to be at the applying level. Conversely, there are times when it is appropriate to have students operating only at the remembering level. It is dependent on the course and the goals of the course. Pause this session and look over the Goldilocks example to gain a better understanding of the Bloom's classification levels. Be sure to pay special attention to what is expected at each level of Bloom's. Next, we will return to our ongoing activity. Refer back to the Bloom's taxonomy chart and the list of 3 or more instructional activities you created earlier in the session. It is your turn to Bloom. Using the Bloom's taxonomy chart and the list of instructional activities you created, determine the level of Bloom's and the verb used for each activity on your list. In order to successfully choose the appropriate verbs, you must take into account where the course falls within the program and whether students have prior knowledge in the content area. In other words, is this the first time students are seeing this, or has it been introduced previously and now they are going more in depth? Pause as you complete this activity. Take a moment and pause to reflect on the Bloom's activity you just completed. The 4 questions listed here are in your learning log. Pause this session and take some time to compose a response to the 4 questions. Locate the Rigor and Relevance Framework with Descriptions document and the Rigor and Relevance blank document. These documents will be used for an activity later in this session. Next, shift your attention to a tool known as the Rigor and Relevance Framework. The Rigor and Relevance Framework is a great tool used to determine appropriate assessment types. The Rigor and Relevance Framework is based on 2 dimensions, including the 6 levels of Bloom's taxonomy and the application model. Let's take a closer look at the Rigor and Relevance Framework. First, take note of the Bloom's knowledge taxonomy levels that run up the y-axis. The 6 levels on the Rigor and Relevance Framework correspond to those found on the Bloom's taxonomy pyramid. Next, take note of the application model that runs along the x-axis. The application model is a continuum of how authentic an assessment or activity is. In other words, does it involve real-world application? The Rigor and Relevance Framework is used to plot the student learning outcomes, SLOs, and enabling objectives, EOs, for a course before developing the course assessments. Based on the quadrant A, B, C, or D that it falls within, plotting the SLOs and EOs on the chart shows the type of assessment most appropriate to assess the SLO and EO. For quadrant A, experiences focus on recall of basic knowledge. Quadrant B, activities provide definite opportunities for students to apply knowledge, typically to a real-world situation. Quadrant C, activities are often complex and require students to often come up with solutions that lead to deeper understanding of concepts and knowledge. In Quadrant D, learning experiences are high in rigor and relevance and require unique solutions to unpredictable problems. Next, let's discuss how to plot SLOs on the Rigor and Relevance Framework. To plot an SLO, you will begin by choosing the level of Bloom's knowledge taxonomy for the SLO. By deciding on that level, you have narrowed the possible quadrants down to 2. Next, decide how authentic or real-world the SLO is. Is it real-world application? Does it involve many disciplines? Or is it limited to course or discipline knowledge? Then, find the rigor and relevance the X and Y axis lines intersect to determine which quadrant the SLO will fall. Based on the quadrant the SLO is in, you can develop the appropriate assessment. It can sometimes be difficult to decide where an SLO or EO falls on the application model continuum. The main thing to focus on is which of the 4 quadrants the SLO or EO lies within. Notice that no matter whether an SLO is at a 3, 4, or 5 on the application model, it will fall in either quadrant B or D, depending on its level of Bloom's taxonomy. So don't get caught up splitting hairs over the difference between a 4 and a 5 on the application model, as they are both real-world applications. The quadrant itself is what matters because that is what determines the appropriate assessments. Remember that all SLOs and EOs must be assessed. Now it's your turn to practice. refer back to the blank Rigor and Relevance document. Using this document, plot the 4 student learning outcomes listed here for the driver's training course. Keep in mind that each SLO can only fall within one quadrant. If needed, refer back to the previous slides on Rigor and Relevance and plotting SLOs. Click the pause button as you complete this activity. Now that the quadrant has been determined for each of the SLOs for the driver's training course, it is time to determine how best to assess each SLO. From the Documents folder listed above this presentation, locate the LCI Strategies document and the Bloom's Taxonomy Chart document. Use these 2 documents to guide you in determining the assessment type most appropriate for each of the driver training SLOs and the quadrant in which each falls. Take a few minutes to look over the Rigor and Relevance framework, complete with each of the driver's training SLOs. Take note of both the quadrant in which the SLO falls and where the SLO is within the quadrant. SLO 1 was placed in Quadrant A because the verb identify suggests that students will need to have an understanding of road signs within the discipline. SLO 2 was placed in Quadrant B because the verb demonstrate suggests that students will need to apply safety check knowledge in predictable situations. SLO 3 was placed in Quadrant C because the verb analyze suggests that students will need to analyze traffic accident data and will need knowledge within the discipline to do so. SLO 4 was placed in Quadrant D because the verb debate suggests that students will debate current traffic laws by evaluating real-world predictable situations. Pause and reflect on why these SLOs fit in the Rigor and Relevance framework as they do. Take a moment to read over this activity summary for each driver's training SLO, including the assessments determined to be appropriate for each driver's training SLO. There are a number of assessments that could be used to assess each SLO. There's not necessarily a right or a wrong choice. The goal is to choose an assessment that is appropriate based on the quadrant in which it falls on the Rigor and Relevance framework. Take a few moments to reflect on the Rigor and Relevance activity you just completed. Did you have any trouble deciding where to plot the SLOs on the Rigor and Relevance framework? Did you have any trouble deciding which assessment types would be most appropriate? How will the skills learned from this activity be useful for your own classroom? Click the pause button and respond in your learning log to the 3 questions posed. So, you're probably asking, how does this impact me? These concepts provide a common language and framework so as educators, we can continuously improve the impact we have on student learning. All of this groundwork provides a basis for planning student learning activities for each class meeting. To prepare instruction and learning activities effectively, we can apply the information learned in Curriculum Tiers 1 and 2 to develop an instructional learning plan for each class meeting. Now we are going to move to instructional learning plans, so let's begin with the question, what is an instructional learning plan? A learning plan is a plan of action, a tool that assists you in arriving at your destination, used to meet student learning outcomes, and used to foster student success. A few guidelines to keep in mind when developing an instructional learning plan. Consider a learning plan as a detailed roadmap to each class session, which offers enough detail so any instructor could successfully teach from it. As you develop a learning plan, you should always start with the end in mind or the no's and do's for the course. When creating a learning plan, remember that all course student learning outcomes, or SLOs, must be addressed and cannot be altered in any way. Also, be aware of the importance of developing a Plan B for your learning plan in case some or all parts of the initial plan fall through for any number of reasons. There are a few basic components that should be included in any learning plan. All of these elements are necessary to ensure that you have a detailed and complete learning plan that will be ready to use in the classroom. From the Documents folder above this presentation, locate the Baker College Instructional Learning Plan template document and the Reference to Effective Lesson Planning document to assist you in your development of a one-week lesson plan for your class. You will need to complete each section on the Baker College Instructional Learning Plan template and turn a completed copy into your Campus Instructional Effectiveness Specialist, or IES. After completing your learning plan, there are 4 remaining questions in your learning log to complete prior to submitting your learning log to your IES. Take a moment to reflect on the instructional learning plan activity you completed by responding to the following questions in your learning log. Why is it important to develop a detailed learning plan? How do you plan to incorporate this information in your classroom? How can the creation of a good learning plan benefit you, the instructor? And finally, how can the creation of a good learning plan benefit your students? If you have questions regarding any information included in this professional development session, please contact the Effective Teaching and Learning Department at etl@baker.edu or your Campus Instructional Effectiveness Specialist. This concludes our session. Click on the quiz link below this video in Blackboard to take a short quiz to check for understanding. You only have to pass the quiz once, but you are more than welcome to review this session as many times as you would like. Please take the quiz so your completion of this session will be recorded.